Welcome to This Can Happen, Lesson 5. Today's lesson is titled Out of the Blues. And before we get started, let me say like this. I don't want to put up a poll here and ask how many feel like you've been getting what you expected to get out of the lesson, but hopefully you've been gaining. However, you would be justified in saying that, Rabbi, listen, I signed up for a class about Mashiach, and you've been talking about light and darkness and the purpose of the world. Now, granted, this is all very much connected to Mashiach, because if we want to understand what Mashiach is all about, then we need to understand about light and darkness. We need to understand about God's presence in this world. We need to set a mission statement for the world if we want to understand what Mashiach is. If Mashiach is the culmination of that mission statement, then we need to figure that out. And that's what we've been doing for the past 2-3 weeks. But for the last two lessons, we're going to revert to talking literally about the time of Mashiach. How is it going to unfold? That will be the topic of today's lesson. What will life be like when Mashiach comes? That will be the topic of next week's lesson. So these are, meaning this, and probably a lot of what we discussed over the last week or two about the spiritual nature and Mashiach being the culmination of the purpose of the world was not necessarily what you were looking for when you signed up for the class, although it's important as part of the general picture of Mashiach. Probably what you signed up for is more the topic of what we're going to discuss this week and next week. And as a little bit of like a, I guess like a teaser, allow me to share with you a text message that I received on May 13th. So that would be after, I believe, after lesson 1. I received a text message from one of our in-person students. And the text message goes like this. Dear Rabbi Z, you do an excellent job communicating the J.L. Mashiach, of course, with passion and personal insight. Thank you. Thanks for the snacks, etc., etc. Fine. Many questions. And he starts to list a whole bunch of questions. Why do we need Mashiach? Life's a blessing regardless. If Mashiach is to come 6,000 years after creation, remember we discussed that in the first lesson, right? The whole kind of narrative of the way and where we're holding in that 6,000 years. Then why be concerned about something that's going to happen long after I'm gone? Why say Mashiach now when we're only on Erev Shabbat and only on Friday, and Mashiach is the entire Shabbat? Mashiach is the entry of Shabbat. Next question, wasn't it suggested that the Rebbe was Mashiach? In which case, what's left to do? Next question, where are all the resurrected dead going to fit? I love it, it's a practical question. What about the non-Jews who are also part of creation? I guess his question is, what is their role in the world of Mashiach? What's wrong with recognizing the glimpses of Hashem in this world as it is without yearning for a future alternative reality? And my favorite question that he ends off with, don't tell me wait for chapters 4, 6, and 7. I guess it means lessons 4, 6, and 7 for answers to these questions and more. He says, and or perhaps to wait for Mashiach for the answers to my questions. Anyways, joking aside, thank you for excellent teaching. Best wishes. And then some advice about the technicalities about the multimedia. So I didn't want to answer him. Wait for lessons 5 and 6, which are really the lessons that most of his questions are going to be answered. Some of them you might recognize that we touched on over the past few lessons, but certainly most of the questions that he answered are going to begin to become clear today over the next 90 minutes or 85 minutes that we have left, and then following that. Next week, the rest of them will become clear. So that's a little bit of a heads up as to what's going on now. And in order to see where we're holding on this, we're going to start off with an exercise. So on page 194 of your textbook, you have an exercise which goes as follows. It's a question. It says, imagine yourself as an active journalist, and Mashiach arrives, and your bosses in the media scramble you for the task of rapidly producing a news article that will professionally inform the public of the astounding development. So based on all that that we learned to date, but also based on the general knowledge you might have, what might your article look like? This was actually suggested as homework that we should give you guys at the end of last week's lesson. I'm not such a big fan of homework. And then see what kind of article everybody comes up with. But let's just do this today as a group. So Patricia, let's start with you. What would be the headline of your article? Mashiach has just arrived, and you're trying to communicate that to your audience. What would you make your headline?
The whole staff quits. Why work?
The whole staff quits. Why work? Very good. Okay, that's a good one. All right. Stephen, you want to give us maybe a lead? You know what a lead is, right? An article's introductory paragraph that briefly captures the story and answers the questions who, what, where, when, why, and how. Stephen, you're muted. Stephen. I think he's busy. Stephen Mother, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Oops. Okay. The Mashiach arrived in Jerusalem today and is holding a press conference at 5 o'clock to
So
answer
instead of
all
asking a
questions.
question, you say all questions should be forwarded to him.
He has been certified by all the rabbinical council,
Oh, okay.
and
That's a,
will outline his mission and his plans.
okay. And Maraika, as we start to get into the details, the body of the text where we actually start to unfold the story, what would you add as the details? Maraika, you with us? What are some of the details that you think there would be in that article about the fact that Mashiach just came?
I don't know. I'm not so good at this. Maybe
Okay.
that there is the great shofar belly.
Okay, a great shofar blue. What else do you know about?
Oh, I don't know.
Vicky, you want to give us something?
No, I just joined, so I'm sorry. I'm not sure where you are. Are you
Here's
on?
what we're doing. No, we're actually just doing an exercise to see where everybody's holding on this. We're going to be describing the time of Mashiach. And for you, the question is on page 198, on page 194, the question is, you have been, Vicky, chosen to be the journalist. You've been scrambled by your bosses in the media, and they want you to report on what just happened. Mashiach just arrived. And Stephen gave us a headline, and Patricia gave us some like a lead to the article, and now it's your turn to give us a body of the article. Tell us what is going to be described in this article, in your article that you're writing about the fact that Mashiach just came, to the best of your knowledge.
Wow. It's a glorious day
Okay.
in the neighborhood, as some people say.
Exactly. It's a glorious day today, bro. All right, what else?
Mashiach has arrived. We are all jubilant and happy. There's dancing in the streets. There's joy everywhere. Hashem is with us. The fear is gone, and joy and peace is among us.
All right. Arnold, you want to give us some quotes from some passersby? As the jury, if you interview a couple people, what do you think the quotes you're going to get are going to be? No, you're muted. Sorry. Go ahead. Yeah. Now you're good.
Quote, "You're kidding."
This is quoted from who? The president? Who?
The average guy on the street.
Okay, no problem. Give me a quote from the Prime Minister of Israel. How about finally a load off my back?
That's a good one. I like that one.
Maybe
Wait, no. The head of Israel, let's just say the former prime minister saying, "What? What's new? You took my job?"
Very good. Yeah, what about the head of the IDF going, "You mean we're no longer necessary?" Something like that.
I'm out of a job.
Out of a job. Okay. So today we're going to try to shed some light on this whole era because there's lots of information we have. I will say that probably any question you will ask me today, the answer will be I don't know. I apologize for that. But because we're discussing a period about which we know. I mean, we know a lot. The Medrash tells us stuff. The Talmud tells us stuff, and we're gonna quote from all those places. But like when we get into nitty-gritty questions, there's a lot of like ambiguity, and a lot of it is because we don't know what's going to happen. Right? When Mashiach will come, that will become clear. But we're going to do our best based on what we do know, to shed some light on this. Okay, everybody with me? So the first question is like this. The first question is Mashiach going to be a sudden occurrence, so out of the blues, like the title of today's lesson, or will it be something that's gradually been occurring over time and will continue to gradually occur until one day it'll just be like, yeah, Mashiach is here. You turn around and you're like, oh yeah, well, naturally Mashiach. Yeah, this is Mashiach. I understand that if you contrast today versus 1,000 years ago, that's sudden, but actually it gradually evolved. So the question is, will Mashiach be a sudden and miraculous occurrence, crazy, out of the blue, or we'll fall down some sort of fairy tale rabbit hole and we'll just end up in a glorious wonderland, boom, right? Or is it going to be more of a gradual occurrence? So On pages 196, 197, 198, 199, all the way through 201, we have 5 texts. We're going to read them one at a time. And what I'd love is, after each one, I'll ask the person who reads it to try to put it into one of the columns on page 201. Okay, so these are quotes that are going to be from scripture, in other words, from the prophets, from Rabbi Yosef Cairo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, from the Zohar, from Maimonides, from the Medrash, from the Jerusalem Talmud. Okay, very basic Jewish sources, well accepted by everyone, Jewish sources, and they seem to be describing the time of Mashiach and addressing this aspect. Will it be sudden or will it be gradual? And what we're trying to do is these 5 texts, which by the way are just a sampling of hundreds that we could have brought today, we're trying to figure out, are they describing Mashiach as a sudden boom occurrence, or are they describing Mashiach as a gradual occurrence? Okay, so we'll start with Arnold. If you can read for us, please, text 1. Go ahead.
Okay, text 1. Behold, I will send my angel, and he will clear a way before me. And suddenly the God whom you seek will come to his temple.
So this is a verse from Malachi, one of our prophets, about the coming of Mashiach. Arnold, in your opinion, is this describing Mashiach as a sudden boom occurrence, or is this talking about it as a gradual occurrence?
A gradual occurrence.
In text 1, you want to read text 1 again?
Behold,
I'm asking your opinion here. I'm asking for your analyzation of text 1.
I will send my angel, and he will clear a way before me. Clear a way before me.
Yeah, but look at the next word.
And suddenly the God whom you seek will come to his temple. That's God. That's not the Mashiach.
Okay, so you say text 1 is a combination of the two.
Yes.
Okay, is gradual and sudden. You're saying it starts.
Well, the gradualness is of the Mashiach. We're talking about Mashiach.
Okay. All right. Text 2, Patricia.
I don't have it.
Oh,
Could
that's
you-
okay. Marika, can you do text 2 for us, please?
When a mortal monarch plans to return to his home, it is typical protocol for his arrival to be announced in advance. An initial announcement may give notice that he will arrive in 10 days, followed perhaps by a second advisory 5 days in advance, and then 4 days, until the final proclamation, the king is approaching the capital. The prophet Isaiah informed us that the Jewish redemption will not unfold in this manner. Rather, it will arrive in the blink of an eye. As he foretold, the first one to Zion, behold, here they are, and for Jerusalem I will give a herald. In other words, Jerusalem's residents will not notice that all the tribes of Israel are converging on their city before the initial announcement is made by the first individual to reach Jerusalem, who will call out, "Look, here they all are about to enter the city." It will be so sudden that the city's residents will not notice a thing before the reality materializes. The announcement and the event will come as one, hence the initial notice. For Jerusalem, I will give a herald, will be, behold, here they are.
So what do you think, Marika? Is this describing the coming of Mashiach as sudden or as gradual?
I think it's kind of describing as sudden.
Yeah, I think so too. In fact, he contrasts it. He says, look, when a regular king comes, there's a whole process. He sends a crier, he sends a person, and slowly, and when Mashiach comes, it's not going to be that way. It's going to be boom. So much so that the residents of Jerusalem won't even notice that Mashiach is happening until it actually happened already. And then boom, they'll be like, what? That was Mashiach? A second ago, I could have thought it, right? So this one is describing it as very sudden. Okay. Stephen, you want to do text 3 for us, please?
Okay. Can I have a question about text 2?
Sure. Can we do it though after? Let's finish this exercise.
That's fine. Okay.
Go ahead.
When God will raise up the people of Israel and redeem him from this exile, he will open a small, thin ray of light for them. Thereafter, he will open another, far wider aperture. Finally, God will throw open the supernal gates that open to all 4 corners of the universe.
Okay. So Stephen, what do we have here? Sudden or gradual?
See, it sounds sudden to me.
sounds sudden? No.
Suddenly lights turn on and the
Yes, the light
universe.
that part might be sudden. It's going to be different, no question. But look how gradual. First a small thin ray of light, then a wider aperture, and only
Yeah.
eventually will he throw open the supernal gates. In other words, the light will enter the world slowly, more and more and more.
Right.
You see that?
Well, that can happen in a matter of minutes, couldn't it?
Well, yeah, but the description here seems to be that there's going to be a process how it's going to happen gradually, not necessarily boom.
Okay.
Right? It's not Alice in Wonderland style.
No.
Okay. We'll be holding here. Vicky, can I ask you to read text 4 for us?
Hi, Zushi, everybody. Hi.
Good to see you. Welcome.
Good to see you. Baruch
Go
Hashem.
ahead. Text 4.
You wanted me to read 4, right?
Yes.
Okay. The Jewish people of that generation will say, is it possible that the world functions as usual and nevertheless the redemption will arrive this year? However, they do not realize that Moshiach's arrival will be sudden.
Okay.
By
So
the
this
way, I'm having to mute periodically because the gardeners are working
That's
literally
okay, that's
outside
okay.
my window. So if you see me come and go, that's
Yeah,
why.
that's okay,
I
Vicky. But
apologize.
we still have a question for you, Vicky. You just read a text for us. What do you think? Is that describing Mashiach's coming as sudden or as gradual?
Huh. Well, I always thought. it
No.
was
I'm not asking, 1 second. I'm not asking for your opinion. The text 4 that you just read. Give me your analyzation of the verse. What do you think? Is that describing Mashiach as coming suddenly or as coming gradually?
Well, I think it's saying it's going to come sudden.
Yeah,
That even though you may not notice it,
exactly. In other
suddenly
words-
it will show up.
In other words, there'll be Jews, very reminiscent of today's Jews. They'll be like, Mashiach can't come this year. There's no way. Look at what's been going on. There's been COVID. There's been this. There's been that. Right? There's been all sorts of unrest. Mashiach can't come this year. We need some time. And they don't realize that Mashiach will come suddenly. Okay, that's text 4. Last one. So bear with me, everybody. Text 5. Simcha Bracha, you want to read for us text 5? Margarit.
Give me just a second, okay?
Okay.
I'll have to find the page. What page is that?
Page 201.
No, it's
Gladly. Thank you. I
That's
just want to
fine.
say thank you so much for sending this message. You
Of
can't
course.
imagine how much it's really necessary for people who live alone sometimes just to have a reminder that we're part of the community
Baruch
and the
Hashem.
mishpucha.
Baruch Hashem. Let's-
It's very good mitzvah. So
You got it.
201,
Text 5.
text 5. Text 5?
Yes.
Sorry. Rabbi Chia bar Abba and Rabbi Shimon ben Halafta once walked through the Arbil Valley and watched the break of dawn. Whereupon Rabbi Chia told Rabbi Shimon, so will be the Jewish redemption. It will begin with small steps, as it is stated. Also, I will sit in darkness. God will be a light to me. Micah 7:8. Then, as it progresses, it will greatly swell and expand.
Simcha Bracha, does sunrise happen in a second like this, like you blink and all of a sudden it goes from dark to light? Or is it sudden when the sun rises? Is it sudden or is it gradual?
I think the sun comes gradual.
It does come gradual, right? Sunrise starts off with, you see a little bit of light and you can't even see the sun, right? You just see like a little bit of light coming up on the horizon. Then slowly the sun rises and you see the sun coming into the sky. And then eventually it lights up the entire heaven and it's day, right?
Yeah.
But it's not in a moment. So Rabbi Chia bar Abba and Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta are walking and they're watching sunrise. And he says that's how Mashiach is going to come, step by step. So this text seems to be implying that it's going to be gradual. So in this exercise that we've just done, you can see this on page 201, you would have to put a few of the texts in the sudden column, a few of the texts in the gradual column. And like I mentioned, I don't want to do this, I don't want to make this exhaustive, but these are only 5 texts. I could do this with lots of different texts from throughout, Jewish literature. There are some that fall in the sudden category and some that fall in the gradual category. Now, just to clarify, this is not a random detail about Mashiach. We're trying to figure out how Mashiach is going to come. And the question really becomes right now, can Mashiach come today? If we believe the Mashiach is a gradual occurrence, then how can Mashiach come today? We're not gradually holding it. It would be a sudden occurrence. So the question is Mashiach coming suddenly or is he going to come gradually? And there seem to be lots of texts that fall on 2 different angles, almost implying that it's somehow both. Okay? So let's see the resolution. The resolution is on page 202. It comes from a verse in Isaiah, and the Talmud describes the difference. Mickey, are you ready to read?
I'm ready.
What?
Okay, so go ahead. Welcome, Laura. It's good to have you with us.
Unsweetened tea.
Okay, go ahead, Mickey. So let's start with
Read.
text 6A on page 202.
6A, okay. The smallest will become 1,000 and the least a mighty nation. I am God. I will hasten it in its time.
Okay, so hold on, Mickey. I'm going to have you read 6B in just a second. This is a verse describing Mashiach. Okay, and it's obviously part of a larger context. But what we want to talk about is literally those last few words. Be'ita achishena. I will hasten it in its time. If that's not a catch-22, I don't know what is, right? I will make it happen very quickly at the right time whenever it's supposed to be. So is Mashiach coming at the right time whenever it's supposed to be? Or is Hashem going to make it happen quickly whenever the right moment is? He's just going to make it happen. In other words, is there a particular date, let's say, I don't know, 20 years from now, that's when Mashiach's going to come? Or could it happen at any moment when we do mitzvahs, Hashem makes it happen quickly? The verse seems to be contradicting itself. Okay, Mickey, so let's help us out. So the Talmud asks this question in text 6b. Go ahead.
Okay, the merit factor. The same verse that states that the redemption will arrive in its time also states, I will hasten it. Is there a set time for the redemption or not? The Talmud resolves this seeming contradiction. If they merit, I will hasten it. If they do not merit, it will occur only when its time arrives.
So this is an interesting resolution of the verse, which is contradicting itself. And it turns out two things can be true at the same time. There are two options, so to speak, as to how Mashiach can come. Option number one, there is a date. There is a date, and that date has been set for thousands of years, probably since the beginning of creation, and that's when Mashiach is intended to arrive. However, even though that time might not yet have arrived, it is possible for us, based on our meritorious actions, what the JLI is titling the merit factor, right? In other words, based on us doing more mitzvahs, us revealing more godliness, as we've discussed in previous lessons, based on all that, we can actually make Mashiach come quicker than he was quote unquote scheduled to come. Okay. Now, I will actually venture to say that these two are not necessarily even mutually exclusive. The way we just described it, it's two options. And either one or the other is going to happen. And we don't know which one is going to happen, right? If he comes at the right time, then the world will be gradually evolving into Mashiach. And if he comes earlier, then there won't be as much of an evolution process and it'll be very sudden. But however, what's if we say it's really both together? And I would argue that not only could it be both together, but that really a true and proper belief in Mashiach includes both of these beliefs. The world is, as we've discussed over the past few weeks, both spiritually and physically, every single moment evolving towards the coming of Mashiach. But even while that's going on, we can, by virtue of us, in my opinion, opening more Chabad houses, bringing more Jews closer to Judaism, doing more Torah, learning more Torah, doing more mitzvahs, etc., having more Zoom classes, all that sort of thing. The more of that we do, the closer we bring Mashiach. And that could actually bring Mashiach today. So back to one of the questions that I quoted from the student who texted me after lesson one. One of his questions was, why would we say we want Mashiach now, right? If Mashiach is going to come, whenever he's going to come, he's going to come. What's my problem? Why am I saying we want Mashiach now? We daven every day for Mashiach, and in the past we've discussed that in the Shemona Esrei, in the Amida prayer, we mention Mashiach no less than 7 times. What's with the obsession of Mashiach? Whenever he's going to come, he's going to come. The answer is yes. Mashiach has a date. And the world is evolving towards that time when Mashiach will be a reality in the world. But it's up to us, me and you and every single one of us, to at any moment bring Mashiach right now. Why? Because collectively, all the actions that have been done over the course of creation until today, over the course of history, every single mitzvah that's been done, every single breaking of the curtain, as we like to call it in this class, of bringing light into the world and showing the truth of God, every single moment of that brings Mashiach that much closer. Okay, so that's kind of the answer to the sudden/gradual question. All right, so let's move on. So let's say, sorry, we're going to take a couple of questions now.
I had a question about
text
Isaiah, the Isaiah quote. Now I see a little bit more of information in text 6a.
Yes.
That Isaiah lived in the 6th and 7th centuries BCE. Was that before or after the Persians reopened the Holy Land?
I do not know.
Where was he living?
That's a good question. I do not know.
Because he talks about the first person returning to Jerusalem and ending our exile. So if
Which quote are you talking about? Which one?
the second quote, the one
Text two?
attributed to Isaiah.
Text 2?
Wasn't that
let's see.
after
I think text 6A.
No, not before.
No?
Yeah, I will give a herald. This would be text 2. Yeah, I think so.
Text 2.
Yeah, he's quoting
Oh, you're
Isaiah
thinking
talking
in the
about
middle of the text. He
the first
quotes-
people to reach Jerusalem and ending our exile. So I'm wondering whether it was before
There's a good
before
question.
the Persians reopened the
I
Holy
don't know
Land.
the answer to your question. I don't know exactly when Yeshaya lived. Isaiah is one of the foremost prophets that prophesies about the coming of Mashiach.
Yes, I know.
So I don't know exactly when he lived, but that's
It says 6th, 7th centuries BCE. It says on page 200.
I don't know exactly where we were holding it that. I'm sorry, my history
Yeah.
is not.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
I think that was after
Okay.
the Babylonian exile.
Yeah,
Because
That's right.
the second temple lasted for 400 years.
Right. I would imagine to say that it's after the Babylonian exile.
before the
I don't know.
Darius, was it the
Darius the Mede. I don't know.
the
I don't know that.
Esther's
I understand what you're asking. I don't know.
Let's just move forward. We can always Google that.
1 second. If somebody has a question, then I'd like to try to answer if I can. Okay, but the answer is I don't know.
Okay.
Even I apologize. I'm happy
That's
to look it
fine.
up for you after the class, and we can take a look at that.
Okay. All right.
So we're now on page 203. So now we've arrived. Okay, so Mashiach is going to happen suddenly. Even though the world is evolving every minute towards the coming of Mashiach, there will also be a moment when Mashiach comes that it'll be sudden and something will happen and Mashiach will come. Okay, so it's going to be miraculous in that way. So once that starts to happen, how is that process going to unfold? So many of you might be familiar, and actually I think I mentioned this in the opening lesson, and kind of when we just started to talk about it, I had mentioned that Mashiach is the stuff of lullabies, right? And hold on just a minute. Okay. Mashiach is the stuff of lullabies, and I had mentioned that at the time, I said this is 5 weeks ago, Menachem had started requesting that when we put him to sleep, we should sing Eliyahu Hanavi, right? Everybody know the song? Eliyahu Hanavi, right? So first of all, a little update. I am still singing Eliyahu Hanavi. I got that's the way kids are. They get hooked on a song. Last night I just sang it to him, and he wanted that one specifically. Anyways, but in that song, the end of the song goes as follows. It says, Bimheira yavo eleinu im Mashiach ben David. In other words, we express our hope that Elijah the prophet, after we refer to him as Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, Eliyahu HaTashbi, Eliyahu the Tishbite, in other words, he came from the city of Tishba, Eliyahu Giladi. As we go through all of these titles for him, then we say, may he speedily come and announce the coming, or with the coming of Mashiach, may it be speedily in our days. This is an interesting fact about Elijah the prophet. In other words, many of you might have been familiar with the fact that he comes to the Passover Seder and we put out a special goblet for him. He comes to the Brit Milah, he comes to the circumcision, we put out a special cheer for him. But what's this business with him and Mashiach? What's the connection with him and Mashiach? So actually, as it turns out, Elijah has a few roles. First, let's see the source for his involvement in Mashiach. Where are we holding here? Let's ask Arnold. Can I ask you to read for us, please? Text 7.
Text 7, yes.
Page 203.
I will send Elijah the prophet to you before the arrival of the day of God.
Okay, so Mashiach is going to come. Elijah the prophet is going to come right before Mashiach's arrival, and he's going to do something then, and we're not entirely sure what. Okay, but before we get to that, let me just tell you a little bit about Elijah, because unfortunately, I mean, I guess for whatever reason it is, most people's association with Elijah is they know that Elijah is the prophet. And their assumption is he's this kind of angel. He comes to the Passover Seder. He's this mystical being, etc. But so let me give you a little bit of background in case you're not familiar. Elijah the prophet was a real live human being, just like me and you. He had a body of flesh and blood, and he was a prophet. He lived in the times of King Achav, and it was at that time that the Jewish people actually were straying from the path of serving Hashem. Probably one of the lowest parts spiritually one of the lowest times spiritually for the Jewish people. Many Jews were serving an idol at that time that was known as the Baal. And you might be familiar with a famous showdown between Elijah the prophet and the prophets, because he was a prophet, literally, like you know of Samuel the prophet, and you know of Eli the prophet, and you know of all these different people. So Elijah was the prophet in his time. He led the Jewish people, and he had a big showdown on a mountain called Har HaKarmel, or Mount Carmel. Still a mountain today in Israel, if you've been. And Mount Carmel was chosen for the showdown between Elijah the prophet and the prophets of the Baal. And this was supposed to be the big shock and awe moment where Elijah is going to show the truth of God to all the Jewish people, and he's going to disprove the falsehood of the prophets of the idol they were serving at that time, which was the idol Baal. Indeed, that's what happens. They each build an altar. It's like a big, people were placing their bets. It was like the, like the big wrestling match of the 10th century BCE, where they're trying to figure out, I think that's when it was around then. Anyway, what they're trying to figure out is this the true God or is that the true God, right? And of course, Elijah proves that Hashem is the true God. And in his famous words, he turns to the Jewish people at the time and he says, Ad matai, until when? Atem potchim al shtei seifim. He says, till when will you jump to both sides? Like sometimes you believe in God, sometimes you don't believe in God, sometimes you're serving idols, sometimes you're not. In any event, leaving all of the history of Elijah the prophet aside, I'm just trying to give you an idea for his time. He inspired the Jewish people to return to God. But leaving all that aside for a moment, Elijah the prophet is probably most famous for the fact that he doesn't die. What I mean by he doesn't die, he has an end of his life, but his soul does not depart his body. As most of you are familiar from the last JLI course, which was called Journey of the Soul, and in which we discussed the soul and the body and the relationship between the two of them, and the fact that at one point the soul leaves the body and what that means and how that works and what our relationship is with the soul after it leaves the body, etc., etc. So Elijah the prophet is the one, I think there's maybe one other one, but he's the most famous exception to that rule. He famously calls Elisha. Elisha was his student and the next prophet of the Jewish people. And he tells him, I want you to watch how I die. And a fiery chariot comes down from heaven. And Elijah gets on the chariot and he goes up to heaven, body and soul. And since that moment, Elijah the prophet has been the one that has been sent down here every once in a while with that body and with his soul to kind of whatever, he reveals himself to certain people, to tell them certain secrets, or to help certain things move along, whatever it is. So for today's, I guess, intents and purposes, Elijah is sort of like an angel, but he has this physical body with him. What is his role in the coming of Mashiach? So we'll try not to quote too many texts here, but they all can be backed up with texts, and you can see this in the additional readings in your textbook if you'd like. But for today's purposes, we'll list them off one at a time. Number one, Elijah the prophet plays the role of heralder. So he's going to announce the fact that Mashiach is coming. Number two, Elijah will inspire, by the way, according to Maimonides, this is the most important one, that he's going to inspire the Jewish people to return to Hashem and to do all the Torah and mitzvahs. Okay? According to Maimonides, this is the main role of Elijah the prophet. And he says this is because he did it successfully once, so he'll do it again. Number three is that Elijah the prophet will restore prophecy to the Jewish people. Being a prophet who lived so long ago, much closer to Moses, which was the beginning of prophecy with the Jewish people. And then at a certain point, prophecy starts with the Jewish people, right? So Elijah is going to be one of the ones that will restore it and bring it back. This makes sense. Number four is another interesting thing. Raise your hand if you've heard of the word teku. If you've learned Talmud, if you've ever been to a Gemara class, you may have heard this word, teku. Teku usually comes at the conclusion of a long page of Talmud where they've gone back and forth and back and forth. Maybe it's this way, maybe it's that way, maybe it's this way, maybe it's that way. And they can't figure it out. And occasionally, the only conclusion they have is teku, which means we're stumped. You stumped the rabbi. We don't know. Listen. And I actually think that teku, which is under 100 times throughout the entire Talmud, that this word appears. Maybe a quick Google search can bring that up. I'll take a look. How many times does teku appear in the Talmud? A lot of articles about it. I don't see an easy answer to how many times. I would venture to say it's under 100 times. So I think that actually shows the beauty of our tradition, that as things get passed down generation to generation, we've placed great emphasis on making sure that things are retained among the Jewish people as a collective. Even if not every Jew knows the whole Torah, but there's always somebody who can answer it. But every once in a while, tradition fails us, and we don't know what the answer is. Is the sacrifice brought this way, or is it brought that way? Do we keep Shabbat this way, or do we keep it that way? And there's a halachic way of dealing with that. You know, we try to choose the most stringent way and do things the best way that we can. However, if we don't have the answer, we don't have the answer. And that's the word teku that appears all the time in the Talmud. However, many commentators point out that the word teku is also an acronym, right? Where each letter stands for something, a Rashi Tevot. And that stands for Taf Yud Kuf Vav, or Tishbi Yetaretz Kushyot Ve'abayot. What that means is that the Tishbite, in other words, Elijah, will answer all of our questions and unresolved queries. In other words, these things that were lost in tradition over time, Elijah the prophet will come and answer them. Okay, and the last one, which is very interesting, is that he will restore the Sanhedrin. Okay, now let me just clarify that. Obviously, the Jewish people living in their land in the most ideal way possible, etc., includes having the Bet Din, the Jewish court of law of the Sanhedrin, the 71 judges who used to sit in the Beit HaMikdash, in the Holy Temple, and they would rule over the Jewish people, right? And they would guide the Jewish people, and they would set policy for the Jewish people, etc. The Sanhedrin has a key component of it, which is that there's supposed to be 71 rabbis. Okay, just before I said hello, Davi walked by, my brother-in-law, for those of you that know him, Davi Hanoka, and he gets a big mazel tov because he just received something called smicha. Raise your hand if you've heard this word before. Smicha?
Yeah.
Yes. So smicha is very often translated as rabbinic ordination, which I guess is our American translation, because in America, in order to do anything, you have to have an ordination. You have to be ordained to be to be a lawyer, to be a doctor, to be a this, and you'd have a license, whatever it is. But actually, that's not literally what the word smicha means. The word smicha literally means resting of the hands. And this is because traditionally becoming a rabbi, okay, and I'll clarify that we're not the way we're talking about rabbis in the current sense. Let's go back to the times of the Talmud. When you finally qualified to be a rabbi, the rabbi who was ordaining you would take his hands and put them on your head, and he would pass along the rabbinic mantle to you, okay? In a ceremony that was known as smicha. Now, what was so important and so valuable about this is that smicha was ish mipi ish mi Moshe Rabbeinu. It was person to person, or rabbi to rabbi, ordaining the next rabbi, the next rabbi, the next rabbi, since Moses at Sinai all the way down to that rabbi. Now, at a certain point, I don't remember the exact point, I believe it was during the Roman era, that smicha was lost. And there were at that point no more rabbis left that were ordained from Moses. And that there was a whole period of Jewish history where there were no rabbis ordained by Moses. And then there was somebody who restarted smicha. Without getting into all the details, he gathered a whole bunch of rabbis together, ordained them all, and then from then on, smicha started again. But there's that big lapse. And meaning even that rabbi who ordained all these other rabbis wasn't ordained by Moses. So the rabbis that we have today are not smicha ish b'pi ish from Moses. So therefore, a true Sanhedrin cannot be unless we have somebody who was ordained by a rabbi, all the way up to Moses to restart it. The only person qualified for that task would be Elijah, because he was ordained rabbi to rabbi since Moses. Then he died, but remember, he went up body and soul. So when he comes back down, he can now restart that chain and make it a direct chain once again from Moses. Now, we could talk about the fact that technically Moses himself could do it. In short, Elijah comes way before the resurrection of the dead, and that's why this is necessary. Okay? That's a short answer to that question. All right, and I think there's no better way to talk about Elijah the prophet's pervasiveness in his connection to Judaism, in his connection to Mashiach specifically, than art. This is a piece of art from a Haggadah. It's a page out of a Haggadah, a Passover Haggadah from 1560. And in it, this is the page when we open the door for Elijah the prophet. And in it, Elijah is depicted as coming with a shofar and blowing the shofar together with Mashiach, who is famously described as coming on a donkey. Okay, so that's enough about Elijah. Any questions?
I have a question, if it's
Go ahead.
okay.
Yes.
We spoke about the redemption. What's gonna happen to the rest of the world, like Goyim and everybody?
Very good
will
question. Today's lesson and next week's lesson are discussing exactly that, Simcha Bracha. We're trying
Okay.
not to just answer it in one fell swoop. We're trying to
Yeah,
break it
sure.
down
Yeah.
piece by piece. So far we've discussed that Elijah the prophet's going to come. I think the next
Okay.
most important thing on the agenda before we discuss what the world will look like is to talk about Mashiach, right? The man, the myth, the legend, the man himself. Yeah. Oh, one second. Another question. Yes, Vicky, go ahead.
Will Elijah look like Elijah? Will we recognize him?
Will we recognize him? Not necessarily. He probably will not look like he looks in the piece of art on page 205.
Or any of the art depicting
Right,
him?
exactly, or any of the art depicted of him, because we probably don't have any art that's accurate to Elijah's persona. But somehow we're going to know that he's Elijah the prophet. That's a good
Is
question.
that
How
because
we're
he's the
gonna-
only one on a donkey, or?
The Mashiach is
I
of
don't
a donkey.
Listen, I once hiked the Grand Canyon, and there were a lot of people on donkeys going by. I should have asked them each, one at a time. You Elijah? You Elijah?
Elijah.
You know, like the
I heard
Chabadniks
when he
stand in the
thought-
corner and they ask, "Excuse me, sir, are you Jewish?" So I could have stood in the middle of the canyon. "Excuse me, sir, are you Elijah?" "Excuse me, sir, are you Elijah?" No, I don't know how we'll know. That's a good question.
It just
Yeah.
occurred to me it could be part of Pesach, the Seder, to have someone blow a shofar when they open the door for Elijah.
Yeah, it could be.
Any particular description of a donkey? We can identify the
Nope.
species.
We don't have any particular description of a donkey. I
Is
apologize.
it gonna be gray or white or blue or whatever?
No
donkey?
question. Oh, I think it does say a white donkey. But either way, leaving that aside, there's as many answers as we're going to give today. There's definitely going to be more questions because, like you see right away, we bring up Elijah the prophet. It's like, so how are we going to know that he's Elijah the prophet? This is a good question. The only person that we're going to answer that about is going to be Mashiach. How are we going to know that he's Mashiach? Because that is important for Jews to know. That's actually important from a halachic perspective. And actually, let's talk about that right now. Okay, so Maimonides is a halachic book, right? Maimonides is Mishnah Torah, his famous magnum opus, the 14 books of the Rambam, it's a halachic work. And his goal when he talks about Mashiach is to bring Mashiach, and he's the most widely accepted and most notable halachic work about Mashiach, which means when he talks about Mashiach, he's not out to describe all of the different beautiful things that are going to happen when Mashiach's going to come. He's like, dude, wait and see. But there are certain elements of it that are halachic. In other words, we have to, for instance, we have to know when we believe in the coming of Mashiach, what are we believing in? And he takes some time to describe that. He also takes some time to describe the fact that Mashiach is going to be a human being and that we have to believe in the coming of a human being as Mashiach. Okay, which is crucial to a Jewish belief in Mashiach. We'll start off though not quoting the Rambam, because we're going to quote the Rambam later as part of a larger quote. We'll start off, and Vicky, if I can ask you to read for us, please, text 8, which is from Rabbi Chaim Vital, who states it very, very clearly.
King Mashiach will certainly be a righteous human born of a man and a woman.
Okay, so step 1 we have about Mashiach is going to be a human being, and he will be born of a man and a woman. I don't want to say who that rules out, but it definitely rules out some candidates that there have been over time. All right. Okay. Text 9, we begin to get a little bit of a resume for Mashiach. Simcha Bracha, can you read for us, please? Text 9. What kind of a person will he be?
Kind of a person he will be. Okay, what page?
207.
Okay. 207. 7. Text 9. Behold, my servant will succeed. He will be exalted and elevated, and he will reach tremendous heights. Isaiah 52:13. This is a reference to the king, Mashiach, who will be exalted over Abraham, elevated higher than Moses, and he will reach tremendous heights greater than the angels.
Wow. So Mashiach is going to be, like you choose literally the best. Like if you have to name 3 figures that are like the greatest figures in Jewish history, I think you'd definitely put Abraham and Moses on there, right? Abraham and Moses, and he's going to be greater than both of them. He'll be elevated higher than Moses, exalted over Abraham, and he's going to reach tremendous heights greater than angels. Wow, if that's not enough. Patricia, oh, you don't have a book, right? So Stephen, if you can read for us text 10, go ahead.
Okay. The king, Mashiach, who will arise from David's descendants, will be wiser than Solomon and a great prophet close to the level of Moses. He will therefore teach the entire nation and instruct them in the path of God. And all the nations will come to hear his words.
Wow. Okay. We just added some more. So he's going to be wiser than Solomon, right? In other words, each person, whatever they excelled at, like Moses excelled at prophecy, Mashiach is going to be literally almost like Moses in terms of prophecy. Solomon excelled in wisdom. He's going to be wiser than Solomon. Abraham his epitome was that he was exalted. He's like the first Jew, etc. Mashiach is going to be even more important in Judaism than him. Wow. This is quite something. And text 11 adds,
for whenever it's time for questions about something in this passage.
You got it. Hold on. And
Okay.
in text 11, Mickey, please. He's also going to be humble. He'll be so great and he'll be humble. Go ahead.
And humble too. Moshiach's uniqueness will be his humility, despite reaching the pinnacle of greatness, due to which he will teach Torah to the patriarchs and to Moses. He will nevertheless achieve the ultimate in humility and self-nullification, due to which he will also teach the simplest folk.
Okay, so he'll be the greatest leader, but he'll be involved with the simplest folk because he is humble too. This is quite a pedigree. And to be honest, we could continue, and I could bring you endless amounts of time, texts fishing for qualities to add to Mashiach's resume. And indeed, by the way, the list goes on and on. But I think when we start to see a whole bunch of things like this about a person, we know and we recognize, we're like, is there one quality? Is there one thing that Mashiach has, which kind of everything else is stemming from that one quality? And the answer really is that there is. Okay. And for this, we have to get to the soul of Mashiach. There is a passage in the Medrash that notes that in the Torah, the soul is referred to by 5 different names. Okay. And this is from Medrash Rabbah, and you may have heard of this concept before. Any soul, in other words, every single one of us has a soul. Our soul is comprised of 5 parts. I'm going to go through this with you briefly. It's a little bit off topic, but it'll soon be directly related. Every person's soul is comprised of 5 parts, and I guess one way of looking at this, because we throw around the word soul a lot, this is kind of the answer. You know, the famous age-old question everybody's always trying to figure out the answer to. Every psychologist and every therapist is like, who am I, right? Who's the real me, right? So Judaism's answer, of course, is the soul is the real me. And we discussed this at length in the last JLI course where we spoke about Journey of the Soul, and I know a lot of you were there. But the soul itself is divided into 5 levels, okay? So we'll go through them one at a time. Number 1 is the nefesh, which literally can be translated as vitality. And that basically is our source for biological life. So the way that we interact with the world on a biological level, right? So we eat, we drink, we sleep, we survive. That's nefesh. That's you as you're expressing yourself through your nefesh, or the biological soul, or the vital soul. The second level of the soul is called ruach, which literally is translated as spirit. And this is kind of the emotional self. So this is when I ask you, who are you? And you define yourself based on your emotions, which of course is only a part of you. That's the ruach expressing itself. So this self goes about the world dealing with everything from an emotional perspective. And it experiences the world emotionally. Number 3, of course, is the neshama. This, by the way, also becomes just a colloquial word that people use generally for soul when they're not getting nitty-gritty and dividing it as we are today. But if you do get technical, this is the intellectual self. So this is when you interact with the world from an intellectual perspective. This is the intellectual self. Okay, chaya is the self that is driven by faith. So when you look at the world through the prism of your faith, that is you expressing your chaya. And finally, yechida, which is the highest of all of them, is your essence. So it is none of the above, right? None of or I should say really none of the below. none of the 4 levels which come forth from it, but it is really you the way you are. You're not emotional, you're not intellectual, but it's really all of them, because it's you who you really are. But before you start to divide into different ways that you interact with the world. Now, why are we talking about? And by the way, just as some reference points that some of you might be familiar with, only 3 of these parts of the soul, the first 3, nefesh, ruach, and neshama, the biological, emotional, and intellectual, only those 3 parts of the soul actually reside within the body, according to the Kabbalah. I know I'm really giving a lot of information here, and if it's not making sense, that's fine. As long as we're getting the general idea, that's the main point here. Those 3 parts of the soul reside within the body. The other 2 parts of the soul, the chaya and yechida, really reside outside of the body in the spiritual worlds, but they affect us the way we are, soul and body. And that's why faith is something that's really, it supersedes us. It comes from a spiritual realm, and it affects us in our lives. I don't know that you can kind of pin faith down to something physical, something that has to do with the physical world, right? Or the soul the way it is enclosed in the body. You might also be familiar with the fact, for instance, that the chaya, that 4th level of the soul, actually enters our body on Shabbat, and it's kind of like an extra layer of soul that infuses our body during the 25 hours of Shabbat, and then it leaves. That's why by Havdalah we smell incense. Again, I'm just giving some reference points for those that are familiar with them. If you're not familiar with these things, that's fine. Yechida, the essential part of the soul, really is always up above, kind of like in the spiritual realms, basking in God's greatness and affecting us at every moment. And that Yechida soul, if it comes down into the body at all, it would only be on Yom Kippur during the Ne'ilah service, kind of like the apex of spirituality when we're most in tune with our soul. But leaving that aside for a moment, there's these 5 levels of the soul. Now, as it turns out, King Solomon tells us that these 5 elements of the soul actually don't just apply to each person individually, but there is also kind of a collective soul of creation. And that too is split into 5 levels. And that's where we get to text 12. So now that we understand this concept, let's get to text 12. Who just read for us? I'm not sure. Mickey, can you read for us?
did.
Oh, Mickey just read. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So let me ask Vicky, can you read for us text 12, please?
Mashiach's fundamental quality is that he is the collective Yehida of the Jewish nation. For the mystics reveal that King David merited the collective soul dimension of Nefesh. Elijah merited the Ruach, Moses the Neshama, Adam the Haya, and Moshiach will merit the Yehida. Of the 5 dimensions that each soul possesses, the lower 4, Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, and Haya, are individualized rungs with particular features and functions. By contrast, the Yehida is the soul's singular, indivisible core. Just as this is true regarding each individual soul, its very essence is the Yehida. The same is true of the life force of all creation. That life force itself has a Yehida. It is the very essence of the divine energy that causes it to exist. And this Yehida is abstract, defying every qualification or form. From this Yehida, all the individualized branches of divine energy necessary for creation emerge. Now, the Mashiach is associated with this collective Yehida of all creation. This essential core energy is unlimited, not only in quantity, but in quality as well. It is entirely perfect and complete. Therefore, when this energy manifests in this world through Mashiach, everything will function at the highest and most perfect level.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there, and hopefully me setting it up a little bit by introducing the 5 levels of the soul gave you a little bit of an idea. But just to recap, what Vicky was just reading for us. So it turns out that the Kabbalah explains that each of us has something called the Yechida of our soul. The Yechida of our soul is not limited to one particular dimension or power of the human experience. No, the Yechida surpasses them all. It's the deepest part of the soul, limitless, eternal. That's the very essence of the soul's being. And Kabbalah further explains that the world also has a Yechida of the world, of creation or of humanity. Call it humanity's Yechida. Okay? And just by way of reference, we mentioned that the other 4 elements of the soul were contained by human beings. 4 of the heaviest hitters in Jewish history: Moses, David, Elijah, and Adam. Right? Now, but Mashiach is going to contain the Yechida of the soul of creation. or what we can call the collective Yechida. Now, just to clarify, he might not know about this, but he will have this very special soul. Okay, and he might go for many years without knowing this. And then at a certain point, he's going to have a transformation, very similar to Moses, where Moses actually, for the first 80 years of his life, he had no idea that he was going to take the Jewish people out of Egypt, that he was going to be the one, so to speak. But then he was, right? So similarly, Mashiach is the same way. For a certain part of his life, he will not know that he's Mashiach. He will not know that he contains this very special soul. And then at a certain point, it will be revealed to him, as is described in text 13. Simcha Bracha, you think you can read for us, please? Following in Moses' path, page 213. Looks like she's not here. So Arnold, if you
No, she's here. She's
here.
here.
Here she is. Okay.
She's here.
She's here.
Page 213.
Hard to know because your video is not on. Page 213, text 13. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Moses, the first Redeemer, reached the age of 80 years with no knowledge or intuition about his eventual role as the Redeemer of Israel. So will it be, God willing, with the future Redeemer. When the time comes, God will appear to him, and then the spirit of Mashiach, that until that moment was hidden in high, will descend upon him, similar to the experience of Moses at the burning bush.
So at that moment, he will be endowed with the Yechida, the collective Yechida of the world. And that's when it will be revealed to him, you are the Mashiach, and he's going to be transformed into this new human being, a very elevated human being, similar to the way Moses was transformed when God revealed himself to him at the burning bush. Now, we're not going to know about that moment. And that could happen. And that could have happened already. And Mashiach will know, and then he will wait to redeem the Jewish people. Now, okay. And this Yechida of the soul, which he has, that's what leads to all of his, exemplary resume. Like, him being such a great person, greater than Abraham, greater than Moses, greater than all these people. Great, amazing. Fine, beautiful. The only catch is that we don't know about it.
And he doesn't. And he doesn't.
No. Once he knows about it, we won't know about it.
Yeah, okay.
So now we get to another very interesting part of halacha, of Jewish law, which is because to date, doctors have figured out lots of MRIs. They can take a scan of you and figure out whether you have cancer, heaven forbid, or whether you have maybe an extra kidney that you can give to somebody, right? Or whether you can, all sorts of amazing things that MRIs can figure out. Blood clots, all sorts of amazing things, right? Heart tremors, but so far there is no spiritual MRI. Hasn't been discovered yet. And therefore we have no way, the Kabbalah hasn't yet figured out a way to take Stephen Muller and stick him on a bed and scan him and say, not Mashiach, or maybe yes, Mashiach. We have no way of doing that.
Or you need a spiritual stint.
Yeah, exactly. You need a spiritual stint.
Sounds like a good movie plot. Huh?
Exactly. It does sound like a good movie plot. But since that hasn't been invented yet, we as the Jewish people need a way that we're going to identify Mashiach. Why? Because we have to follow Mashiach. This is a crucial part, is that we're going to accept him as our king Mashiach. And not only that, we have to be able to identify him and see and say, oh, this is him. So whose job does that fall to? That falls to Maimonides. Because Maimonides, in his halachic work, to help us figure out how are we going to know who Mashiach is by symptoms, right? Because that's what happens. When doctors can't figure it out with an MRI, they say, okay, the best we can do is look at your symptoms. You have symptom X, symptom Y, symptom Z. This means you have this and this thing, right? And the more symptoms you have, the more they can narrow it down to exactly what you have, right? So similarly with Mashiach, we need to figure out what are the symptoms of Mashiach. And the more symptoms we have, the more we'll be able to say this is Mashiach. So Maimonides helps us with this. And in fact, he divides it into a two-step process. Arnold, can I ask you to read for us, please? Text 14.
When a king from the house of David will arise, who, like his ancestor David, diligently studies the Torah and observes the mitzvot as prescribed by the written law and the oral law, influences all of Israel to walk in the way of Torah, which rectifies the breaches in the observance and wages God's battles. This person is presumed to be the Mashiach. If he succeeds in the above, and he builds the temple in its place and gathers the dispersed of Israel, he is certainly the Mashiach.
Thank you, Arnold. So far we know about Mashiach's insides, right? We know that Mashiach is the collective Yechida. Mashiach's soul embodies this Yechida. This special soul will descend into him. But how will we know about it? The Rambam helps us out. He says there's a two-step process. The first step process is identifying a potential Mashiach or a presumed Mashiach. And once we identify a presumed Mashiach, we can begin to follow him, but he's not actually Mashiach until he confirms his identity as Mashiach by doing certain things. So this is all in text 14, but let's divide it here. You can follow along with us either on the screen or on page 215. Our presumed Mashiach has to have four things. Number one, he has to be a descendant of King David, father to son. Okay, you might be familiar. Raise your hands. Anybody ever read the story of Bastanai? Bastanai was a anybody? Raise your hand. No. Okay. Well, it's a great book that you can read if you'd like. Marcus Lehman has a good English version of it. If you'd like to go on Amazon and buy it, Bustenai, Bastanai. Because the Davidic line is so important in Judaism, of course, there were people who wanted to destroy it. I think in Bastanai's times it was the Muslims. I read the book years ago, so I might be misquoting it. But either way, Bastanai was the last living sole survivor who was father to son from King David. There's a whole story about how he survived, and he went on to get married and have many children, and the Davidic line continued. To date, there are people who know, and there are family trees. And I should point out that we don't need this potential Mashiach to tell us, for a fact, and because I'm not sure if there is any way that we could really know for a fact. We could question his family tree from today to tomorrow, right? But he needs to at least have, at least in Maimonides' discussion, at least as verifiable as people who are Kohanim today. You look at them and they say, yeah, I'm a Kohen. My father was a Kohen. His father was a Kohen. And everybody knows that. It's well-documented information. Similarly, this Jew has to have a family tree that goes back to David, to King David, father to son, that at least it's, to the best of our knowledge, true that he comes from the line of David. Okay. Number two, he also has to be supremely pious and well-versed in the Torah. That's a much easier thing to verify, right? He has to be a tremendous Torah scholar and have a piousness, in other words, a desire and in practice, a keeping to Hashem's word that parallels, some of the greatest people in that generation. Like extremely pious and following the word of Hashem entirely. Okay, number three. By the way, in case you're wondering and saying that, oh, that's obvious. Some of the false Mashiachs that we've had over the years could have easily been ruled out just based on that criteria, because many of them went on to change Judaism and then subsequently to found their own religions, right? So that's obviously a crucial problem in somebody who's claiming to be the Jewish Mashiach.
Anyone specific in mind?
I don't have anyone specific in mind. I'm just saying in case there was anybody like that. Okay. Fine. Number three.
Pointing fingers.
Yeah, exactly. No, we're not pointing fingers. Number three, he has to influence the Jewish people to follow the ways of the Torah. Again, some of these people went on to divert the Jewish people away from the Torah. Right? And remember, we're not even talking about a confirmed Mashiach here. So far, we're just talking about a potential Mashiach. And we'll talk about what happens if somebody is a potential Mashiach and then doesn't actually become a confirmed Mashiach. Is that disgrace or not? It's not necessarily. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then he has to wage God's battles. And there's different opinions about this, whether this is physical battles. In other words, does he have to be a king who leads the Jewish people out to battle to conquer nations? Or it could be a spiritual level. He fights spiritual battles of Torah, true Judaism to keep Torah and mitzvahs alive. Hashem's battles on a spiritual level. Now, but all of this makes, and by the way, there's a lot of discussion about whether he needs to necessarily make his appearance in Israel. It doesn't seem that necessarily, that there are conflicting views, but it doesn't seem that it necessarily needs to be that way. There are some sources that say that he can start his journey in the diaspora. In other words, it can be in America, it can be in Canada, it can be anywhere, and then eventually make his way to Israel. So it doesn't necessarily need to mean that he starts in Israel. And in this stage of what the Rambam calls Cheskas Mashiach, or presumed Mashiach, this man is now becoming a worldwide known figure. And Jewish people start to follow him. He's inspiring them to keep Torah and mitzvahs. He's waging God's battles. He's a pretty public figure, and he's starting to raise that momentum. It's at this stage of the game that Jews can throw their weight behind him, say, we believe this man could be Mashiach, they cannot say we believe this man is Mashiach because he hasn't actually confirmed himself as the King Mashiach. What does he have to do in order to confirm himself as the King Mashiach? Back to the Rambam in text 14. Maimonides says he has to do 3 things. Number 1, he has to have done and be successful at everything in the presumed Mashiach stage. Okay, so that's number 1. And then 2 things, A and B, he has to ingather the Jewish people. In other words, he has to bring all of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. And number 2, he has to build the 3rd and holy temple. So that rules out anybody to date, right? Nobody has become the confirmed Mashiach to date, obviously. Mashiach is not here yet. In case anybody asks you, anybody ever suggests to you, maybe Mashiach is here already, here you have a clear answer. These 2 things didn't happen, Mashiach is not here yet. If all the Jewish people were not gathered from exile to the land of Israel, Mashiach is not here yet. Even though we now have this beautiful modern state of Israel and many Jews are there, not all the Jews have landed in the land of Israel, and not even by a far stretch of the imagination, right? I mean, there's more Jews outside the land of Israel than there are in. And similarly, building the 3rd and holy temple, not something that can be contested. Mashiach will have to do that. Once all of those things are accomplished, then we can say that Mashiach is confirmed and he is the official Mashiach. Yes. Okay, let's take a break now for some questions. I think, Vicky, you raised your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, I did. I have a couple of thoughts. Number 1, is it possible the Mashiach has been born, so he is physically here, but since he's not going to be recognized as Mashiach for a long time, he may not have continued his journey far enough. He might be still a student. He might still be learning Torah. So it is possible he's here, but he's not ready to be shown as the
correct.
Mashiach.
That absolutely is possible to be the case. In fact, that is what the next section is about. That would be the perfect segue to the next section, and I would grab it, but I have 2 more questions to answer before we continue.
Okay,
so, Stephen, go ahead.
And then I have a second question about the building the question. Okay, building the temple. That would imply that it can't be instant because it takes time to build the temple. So how do you grapple with the Mashiach can just suddenly be here when in order to prove your Mashiach, you have to have built the temple, and that certainly is going to take time, you know?
That is a very good question. I actually happen to have the answer. This is a typical question that I would say I don't know about, but I happen to have studied about this. There are 2 options about how the Mashiach can build a temple. One is that he will literally start and hire a team, you know, and any contractors on this Zoom now? Anyone want to volunteer? Right? Or cement people. He's going to need everybody. He's got concrete people, you know. He can be in touch with Rabbi Hanoka. Rabbi Hanoka is an amazing contractor. He's been doing the mikvah all on his own. So that's one option. And the other option is that the 3rd temple will actually come down from heaven and Mashiach will put it in its place and then put the doors on it. So it'll be a very miraculous experience. So there's actually 2 options as to how that can happen. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, so there you go.
We
Okay.
have the problem of the dome of the rock.
Well, we get a lot of questions here. Stephen Muller, go ahead.
Okay, this is the obvious question to me.
Okay.
In this day and age, how do we know who is from the house of David?
So again,
I suppose if we find an ossuary with David's bones, we can get a DNA test.
DNA sample, right? I actually, at the in-person class, somebody asked if 23andMe would be enough for this kind of, like, maybe there's a Davidic line gene that we're not familiar with, and then we can figure it out that way. Halachically, which means according to Jewish legal law, the way the Rambam lays it down, as I mentioned when I was laying down that criteria, for us it's enough that it's uncontested that he comes from the house of David. In other words, there are some pretty famous Davidic line family trees. You can go online, you can Google this. For instance, I know the Alter Rebbe, so the first Chabad Rebbe, was famous that he was really, there's a couple of famous personalities. There's the Maharal of Prague. He was known to have been, who lived about, I don't even know actually, maybe 400 or 500 years ago. I don't remember exactly. He was famously father to son from King David. So anybody who comes from him comes from that line. And then a couple generations later, there was the Alter Rebbe who came from him, father to son, and he's also a pretty famous personality. And he also, now these people,
how did they know?
Well, they have a family tree that goes all the way up. I have seen family trees like this that literally list every single person. It's not that many people, by the way. It's only been about 80 generations, father to son, since
all the way back to David.
All the way back to King David, yeah. Now, granted, some of those people lived 20 years, you know, I mean, they had a child, and then 20 years later, they whatever it is. And some of them are 80, 90, 100 years, whatever, you know, depending how long they lived. but it's 80 father to sons, about 80 father to sons that you need to do all the way back to King David. And there are some family trees like that that exist. Now, like I said, I don't know that me or you, Stephen, can actually legitimately question that. We're like, oh, I don't know. You go back 20 generations, and you have this random person who's the son of a random person, and they're not random, by the way. Many of them are pretty famous rabbis, but still, and I can't disprove that, but maybe it's not true, right? So far as we are concerned as Jews, in order to believe in somebody as Mashiach, it's enough that he has a family tree and it's unquestionable. Nobody really has any secure questions. Similar to Kohen status, right? When somebody walks into Chabad and tells me they're a Kohen, or you know what, let's not take somebody walking into Chabad, because then I actually don't know who he is. But if I grow up with somebody as a kid and we always knew he was a Kohen, right? And his father was a Kohen, his father was a Kohen. And yes, I don't know every single person from him all the way up to the tribe of Levi. And by the way, there are some family trees like that as well that go all the way up. And like, for instance, the Segal family famously has that. And I believe there's another family, I forgot which family, or maybe the Horowitz family. These are some famous Levite families, and they have father-son family trees all the way up till Levi, the son of Jacob, the son of Yitzchak, the son of Abraham, etc. So family trees exist like that. Can we say 100% with certainty? No, but it's I guess in the secular courts of law, they would call it beyond a reasonable doubt. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's what's required of us. Okay.
Okay, I had also an observation. That was my impression of the Chaya in Yechida. It seems that Yechida is the essence of monotheism. This is the sense that everything there's a light force that's connected, and that's the Hashem, and it pervades everything. And perhaps the Chaya is our awareness of that.
Right. I would agree with that. I would just say that all 5 levels are really monotheism. In other words, the fact that there's a life force, and that life force is within us. In other words, that we have a spark of God inside of us that we call a soul. All 5 of them are that. Just every one of the 5 is on a different level of consciousness. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, sure.
There we go. All right, Yosef Ilan, you had a question?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Mickey, go ahead.
I have a question. Yeah, on the previous page, we read that when the time comes, God will appear to him. Then the spirit of Mashiach, that until that moment was hidden on high, will descend upon him. So is that going to be before or after these 5 conditions
way before.
So the person who will be the Mashiach will know that for a long time.
Before we know it.
Before we know it.
Correct.
Okay.
Maraika, go ahead. First of all, I want you to apologize to Vicky. I realized just now we have a Vicky and a Mickey on here, and sometimes it gets confusing who I'm calling on. So Vicky, I'll be with you in a minute. Maraika has been waiting patiently for a question. Go ahead.
I've heard once that when half of the Jewish people, or more than half of the Jewish people, are in the land of Israel, that prophecy will return. Is it true or false?
I don't know. I've never seen a source for that. I would love to see a source for that. I'm not saying there isn't, but I've never seen that. Okay, so the answer is, I guess I don't know. Okay, now Vicky with a V.
In any of our Israeli artifacts, I know they've been digging all around various places, and do they have anything that was owned by or traced to King David that they could extract DNA from?
I don't know the answer to that question, but that would be a fascinating perspective. I don't know.
Or you would think that somebody would want to try to do that so that when the Mashiach comes, they will actually have a quantifiable scientific way, as Maimonides would say, of proving, Yeah,
not entirely, because that wouldn't be enough. He needs to have all the other qualities as well, but at least
but it would eliminate one.
Yeah, you're saying we're almost close to a Mashiach MRI. Okay. So Vicky, back to your original question, which was the perfect segue, I felt, which was you were trying to figure out, so does that mean the Mashiach is alive now? Maybe he's in yeshiva studying Torah and he's here now. So the answer is a 100% resounding yes. And I will call you back to a text that we mentioned in lesson 3. You may remember that Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi asked he asked Elijah the prophet, where is Mashiach? And he told him where he is, right? And he went to go see him, and he was changing the bandages one at a time. Does anybody remember this?
Yeah, at the gate.
This is a description from the Talmud. He's at the gate with the poor people, and he changes his bandages one at a time, just in case the Jewish people will be meritorious, and then he'll reveal himself. This starts to hint, and we'll see it soon, at the reality that there's actually been many Mashiachs over the generations. In fact, every generation has a potential Mashiach who can become the Mashiach of that time. Because if you think about it, if that was Mashiach then, Mashiach today has got to be about 2,000 years old, right? And so then we're going to be taken out by a 2,000-year-old man. Maybe Mel Brooks is the Mashiach. Right? Isn't Mel Brooks the one who did the 2,000-year-old man? Who was that?
Yeah.
Right?
That was Mel Brooks, yeah.
Maybe-
With Carl
Mel
Reiner.
Anyways, so I guess what I'm trying to point out here is that, and we're going to bring a couple more texts to show this, is that there have been many people throughout the generations who were Mashiach in that time. Let's see text 15 for another example of this. Stephen, you want to read for us, please?
Okay, text 15, good. Okay, a man was plowing his field when his ox suddenly lowed. An Arab passerby inquired, "What is your nationality?" "I am a Jew," the plowman replied. "Untie your ox," the Arab advised, "and unharness your plow." This was considered a sign of mourning. Why? Because the Jewish Holy Temple has just been destroyed. "What is your source for this information?" the Jew demanded. "I deciphered that from your ox's low," replied the Arab. As they were talking, the ox suddenly lowed once more. "Harness your ox and retie the plow," the Arab exclaimed. "The Jewish Redeemer has just been born."
Okay, this text has had a lot of ink spilled over it, and I don't want to get into it. Many people have been trying to, many commentators for many years have been trying to figure out whether this is a literal story that happened or if it's a metaphor. But the one thing they seem to be in agreement about is that at that time, which was the time of the destruction of the temple, okay, so this is the year 70 CE, at that time, Mashiach was born. In other words, as the destruction of the temple was happening, Mashiach was born. That seems to be a consensus as to what this text is telling us, right? This is from the Talmud. Again, by that count, Mashiach should be 2,000 years old. And that's where we're getting here. Text 16 introduces the idea that actually every single generation has another Mashiach or another potential Mashiach. Vicky with a V, please. Text 16.
In every generation, a descendant of Judah is born who is a befitting candidate to be the Jewish Messiah.
Okay. So if in every single generation there's a person who could be Mashiach, then what's your question right away? Who's the one today? Right? Who could it be? Now, obviously, it could be an obscure person, right? But throughout history, many people have always played the guessing game, you know, like play the name game. Let's try to figure out who it is. And obviously, it could be an obscure person who's sitting at a gate changing bandages, but you got to think that a man with a pedigree like we described, right? Even though he may or may not have already had his transformation to become a Mashiach, but you got to think a man with a pedigree like that, or on the way to a pedigree like that, is probably a pretty well-known person. And this leads to the name game in the Talmud. Mickey with an M, if you can please read for us text 17.
Okay. What is Mashiach's name? The scholars of Rabbi Shilah's Academy would say.
You'll never
His
guess who
name-
they guessed.
What's that?
I said you'll never guess who they thought it was. Go ahead.
Okay. His name is Shilah. As it is stated, the scepter shall not depart from Judah until Shiloh comes, and all the nations will rally to him. It's from Genesis 49:10. The scholars of Rabbi Yanai's Academy would say, his name is Yinon, as it is stated, may his name endure forever. For as long as the sun, may his name continue. It's from Psalms. The scholars of Rabbi Hanina's Academy would say, his name is Hanina, as it is stated, for during your exile, I will show you no favor. It's from Jeremiah. Some scholars insist that his name is Menachem, the son of Hizkiah, as it is stated, because at the time of the destruction, the comforter, Menachem, that should relieve my soul is far from me. That's from Lamentations.
I may be Mashiach's dad.
You don't know.
His name could be Menachem. And no, I'm kidding. It says Menachem, the son of Chizkiah. All right. Okay. We ruled him out. Next.
Rabbi Nachman stated, if the Mashiach is among the living, he is a person who already occupies a government position, such as me, as it is stated, their prince shall be of themselves, and their governor shall proceed from their midst. That's from Jeremiah, another one from Jeremiah. Rev stated, if the Mashiach is among those currently alive, he is the holy Rabbi Yehuda, the prince. If the Mashiach is among the dead, he is Daniel the beloved.
Okay, thank you, Mickey. So there's a lot to unpack here. First of all, the most straightforward thing that we're seeing here is that Jews have always been looking who is the Mashiach. More importantly, we see that students tended to always feel it was their rabbi. You know, if they were following that rabbi and they felt he was a holy rabbi and a well-learned rabbi, and he was inspiring them to Judaism, then it's only reasonable that they should assume that he's the Mashiach, right? Now, these verses that they're quoting are not necessarily conclusive proof. They're just bringing a proof like it would make sense that he's the Mashiach based on this verse. Right now, obviously, they can't all be true, right? Or can they? So based on what we just said, if there's a Mashiach in every generation, I don't know if any of these people lived at the same time, but it could have been all these people. And he was the Mashiach at that time, but the Jewish people were not meritorious, and therefore he didn't reveal himself. He either was or he wasn't. We don't know. By the way, some of these people are the greatest scholars of their time. Rabbi Yehuda Anasi certainly was one of the most influential Jews of the Talmudic era, right? He compiled the Mishnah. So that's one thing that we see here. But another interesting point, which I'll point out at the end, I know this gets very, very iffy and whatever, is that it seems to be from that last paragraph that the Talmud is insinuating that it's possible that Mashiach can actually be from the dead. Which is a very interesting perspective, because if there's a Mashiach in every generation, then wouldn't you assume that if that person is coming, if he's from the dead, then why do we need to have a dead person come back to life? Maybe that person could just come back in another iteration, just like he's been coming back over and over again in different iterations as a new Mashiach. So that's the question. And we're going to leave that off the table for today because that could really get complicated. There's a lively debate about it among the commentary, whether Mashiach could actually be from the dead or not. I will mention one interesting point, which is that the Stei Chemed, which is one famous commentary, points out that actually he says that the Jewish people, if they're meritorious enough, Mashiach will even come back from the dead for them. That it could be, I guess we could look at it kind of as like, depending on how meritorious the Jewish people are and how their Torah mitzvahs is evolving, it might bring a particular person to be Mashiach, and they might be meritorious, in his words, that he'll come down from the clouds. But for the purposes of our conversation, and also because most commentators are in agreement that Mashiach will be from the living, let's leave that aside, okay? Lest you say that this practice kind of ceased, and that, in the Talmudic times, people were trying to figure out who Mashiach was. It's actually not so. We can go back 300-400 years and see it again. Text 18. Mickey, you want to keep going?
Sure. In each generation, people would assume that a particular individual was the Mashiach, if the redemption were to occur at that time. In his generation, it was declared and accepted that Rabbi Judah the Prince was the suitable candidate to serve as the Mashiach. Similarly, the students of Rabbi Yitzhak Luria, the Arizal, wrote that he was the Mashiach of that generation. All this is a straightforward matter.
In other words, people are trying to figure out who Mashiach is. This doesn't make them heretics. The fact that they say that they feel their rabbi is the Mashiach is beautiful. Let me make it very clear. Not a single one of them ever claimed that Mashiach is here. In other words, the Messianic era has arrived and we have now been redeemed just because this person is alive. No, they were saying, we believe our teacher is the Mashiach, and if we can be meritorious in this generation, then he will be it, and he will come and he will reveal himself and be the Mashiach.
As it was with the Rebbe.
So I was going to say this is a perfect time to segue into this topic, which many people are very curious about. And some of you have asked me this question, and others of you are probably just too respectful to ask the question. And you're like, oh, I don't want to get too chutzpahdik, But there were many Hasidim who believed, and there are still Hasidim till today that believe that the Rebbe is Mashiach. And I think that this is a really natural phenomenon. In other words, it says something about someone if people are saying they're Mashiach. Why? Because even though the Rebbe never confirmed either way, right? The Rebbe never confirmed or denied that he was Mashiach. However, the fact that somebody, think about it, the Rebbe is a rabbi, great rabbi, encourages people to follow in the ways of Torah and mitzvos, he's checking many of the boxes for Mashiach. So Hasidim, who believe that their rabbi is a very inspirational leader, say, And I'll add on that the Rebbe also lived Mashiach. In other words, the Rebbe would talk about Mashiach and did practical things to bring Mashiach in terms of Chabad houses, etc. And the Rebbe would say this is all in order to bring Mashiach. I don't know that there were that many people in that generation. Not I don't know. I know for a fact that there weren't that many people in that generation who lived like that. So it was only natural Hasidim to suggest that the Rebbe would be Mashiach. And in that regard, I'll quote Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, who is the former Rosh Yeshiva, for those of you that are familiar, of YU, or Yeshiva University. And he's a son-in-law of the founder of Yeshiva University, Rabbi J.B. or Yashaber Soloveitchik, who was arguably one of the greatest rabbis in his time, same time as the Rebbe, and a very, very good friend of the Rebbe, way back from their time in Germany and pre-war, etc. So at the Rebbe's funeral, hold on, maybe it wasn't the Rebbe's funeral. I apologize. Could be it was in a eulogy delivered for the Rebbe somewhere else. I don't think it was at the Rebbe's funeral. To the best of my knowledge, there weren't any eulogies for the Rebbe at his funeral. But in a eulogy for the Rebbe, he pointed out that there was nobody that ever suggested that his father-in-law was Mashiach, even though he was one of the greatest rabbis of his generation. Similarly, he pointed out by Rabbi Moshe Feinstein that nobody ever pointed out that he was Mashiach. And his suggestion was that why would it be that people pointed out that the Rebbe was Mashiach is possibly because, again, this is not coming from a Chabad source, he said possibly because everybody saw in the Rebbe somebody who lived Mashiach and who wanted Mashiach with every fiber of his being, plus he checked off some of the boxes for Mashiach, so therefore they suggested he might be the Mashiach. But I think it's very, very important to note, and I think there were some Hasidim who made this mistake, and those I will condemn right here on air, on recording if you'd like. Before the Rebbe passed, or even after the Rebbe passed away, etc., or even today, I think it's very important to remember that while we can point to people that are Mashiach from today to tomorrow, we cannot say Mashiach is here. And if you find even a single Chabadnik like that, I'll take him to task and I'll have that conversation with him, which is, we cannot say that we are living in the Messianic era. We can say that person is the potential to be Mashiach, but by all counts, the third base of Mikdash has not been built, and the ingathering of the exile has not happened, and many other things besides. So Mashiach is not here yet. The Messianic era has not begun to happen. So even if we want to say that one person or another person is Mashiach, in whatever generation you might live, it's important to appreciate the fact that Mashiach is not here. By way of analogy, if you are at a wedding, and you watch them break the glass, and you watch them, break the plate, and you watch them have the reception, all these sorts of things. It's important to understand that all of those things might mean you're at a wedding, but these two people are not married, and that's a very, very big difference. Until that magical moment happens, when the groom slips the ring onto the bride's finger and he says, "Harayat mekudeshet," they are not actually married. You might be experiencing precursors of marriage. You might be saying they're getting married, but to say that marriage is happening, marriage has happened, you'd be 100% in the wrong until the ring goes over the finger, right? Because according to Jewish law, that's when two people are married. And there's lots of halachic implications in this matter. For instance, if the bride and groom should sleep with each other before he slips the ring over his finger, that's a huge difference between two married people performing a very holy mitzvah, right? Or one of the greatest sins that there could be, right? So that's what's going on here. We can identify Mashiach as much as we want, but it's important to remember that Mashiach is not here yet. Okay. We are running very, very late. But I really feel like the next section is a valuable section to do. I want to do some historical attempts, and particularly to talk about the difference between a failed Mashiach or a false Mashiach. A false Mashiach is a man that by no accounts was he ever Mashiach. He never checked any of the boxes, even for a potential Mashiach. And that false Mashiach, even while he's making his Mashiach bid, he and people that are following him, and hold on, this is important. This is an important segue. So the reason we're doing this now is because in every generation we have a potential Mashiach who's born and who's there ready to bring Mashiach. So really, in every generation, there were people who could have brought Mashiach, but there are many missed opportunities. So this now brings us to a conversation of, were there historical attempts at Mashiach? Okay, and there were some historical attempts at Mashiach, which we're going to call failed Mashiachs, which means they checked off all the boxes for potential Mashiach. They could have been, just the Jewish people weren't meritorious enough, and that's why they died and life moved on, and they weren't Mashiach. They weren't the actual Mashiach, but they could have been a very strong potential Mashiach, and they made a full-on Mashiach bid, and everything was nice. And they actually don't go down as villains in our history. They go down as amazing Jewish kings from the Davidic dynasty who died, and therefore they're not Mashiach. And we're going to bring one example of someone like that, and that will be Bar Kokhba. If you're not familiar with him, in a moment we're going to watch a video on him. And then we're going to bring an example of someone who was just literally a villain. He was a terrible person who pretended to be Mashiach, even though he was not at all. And there were many things in his lifetime that both he and other people could have seen to see clearly that he was not the Mashiach. But for whatever reason, maybe because he was charismatic or whatever, and we'll talk about it a little bit, he went on to pretend to be Mashiach, but he was a false Mashiach. Into this category, I would put both false Mashiachs from both major religions. But for the purposes of today's conversation, we're going to talk about Shabtai Tzvi, who was another example of a false Mashiach. Not a failed Mashiach, a false Mashiach. But let's start off by talking about a failed Mashiach, which is Bar Kokhba.
Okay,
Oops.
this is the course up
Where is the sound?
I'm sorry, I apologize. That's my fault, the sound. Let me take it back and do it again. Hold on. I know what the problem is. But how do we get it? Hold on. Okay, so let's do it again.
While you're doing that, I thought that Isaiah said that his name would be Emmanuel.
There are a lot of names thrown around.
Yeah.
I guess it's a question we could talk about. Hold on. For now, you guys can see?
Yeah.
Okay, so let me just start the slideshow, play, and audio is good?
From its inception, the Jewish nation lived with a messianic vision. Even in the worst of times, the Jews anticipated the rise of their star, a savior from the tribe of Judah who would liberate them from foreign subservience and enable religious freedom. 2,000 years ago, Rome stretched forth its mighty branches. In 6 of the Common Era, Judea, the heart of the Jewish homeland, became a Roman province. A few decades later, in the wake of the Great Jewish Revolt, the Romans destroyed the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. That marked the onset of the Jewish nation's exile and persecution. At the same time, the Jews could now anticipate their liberation through the promised Jewish Messiah. In 117 CE, Hadrian became Roman emperor. He toured the empire, erecting pagan temples and promoting Roman beliefs. When he reached ruined Jerusalem in the year 130, he ordered the city plowed over and rebuilt as a Roman city named Aelia Capitolina, with a temple to Jupiter, the chief Roman deity, erected on the site of the Holy Temple on the Temple Mount. This was more than the Jews could take, and in 132 CE, a major revolt began unlike any other. The rebels assaulted the Roman garrison stationed in Judea and succeeded in capturing and holding part of the territory. As Jews from the diaspora flocked to join the cause, Hadrian responded by sending massive reinforcements from Syria, Egypt, and Arabia, but these were similarly defeated. Rome was badly shaken. Hadrian realized the need to muster a truly enormous army in response. He summoned legions from across the globe, including his best general, Julius Severus, who was ordered to travel from Britain with 3 European legions, and units were dispatched from as far as the Danube. Nearly 1/3 of the colossal Roman army was redirected to counter the Jewish revolt. The Jewish army was led by Bar Kokhba, about whom we know precious little.
The name Bar Kokhba wasn't really the man's name. We actually know his name was Shimon Bar Kosiba, but he was called Bar Kokhba because of a biblical verse in the book of Numbers, Darach Kochav Yaakov v'kam shevet Yisrael, that a star will come forth from Jacob and a staff will arise from Israel. And this verse was understood to refer to the Messiah. As far as we know, many Jews believed that Bar Kokhba was indeed the Messiah and that they were supporting the coming of the Messiah in participating in the revolt.
Such views were reinforced by Bar Kokhba's military gains and his liberation of Jerusalem.
What's really amazing is that during the period of Bar Kokhba's rule, he put out coins. On the back side of some of these coins was actually the words Elazar Kohen, Elazar, the high priest, apparently. And this may indicate that they tried to restart sacrifices.
Despite Bar Kokhba's widespread support, the Jewish sages were sharply divided on whether Bar Kokhba was the Messiah.
There were different views among the very important rabbis that we know from the Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva was convinced that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. The Jerusalem Talmud actually records him as saying, "This is the King Messiah." At the same time, others, like Yochanan ben Torta, were convinced that he couldn't possibly be the Messiah. And he told Rabbi Akiva that grass will be growing on your nose, meaning you'll be in the grave before this guy will ever be a Messiah.
Eventually, the tide turned. The legions launched a campaign of systematic annihilation that left Judea almost entirely depopulated. The Roman historian Dio Cassius writes, very few of them in fact survived. 50 of their most important outposts and 985 of their villages were razed to the ground. 580,000 men were slain in the various raids and battles, and the number of those that perished by famine, disease, and fire were past finding out. Bar Kokhba withdrew into the fortress town of Beitar. It was besieged and fell in 135 CE, ending the revolt. Its occupants were slaughtered in an enormous massacre on the 9th of Aleph, the date in the Hebrew calendar on which the first and second temple had been destroyed. Bar Kokhba died there, and Hadrian bitterly oppressed the Jews and the Jewish practice in retaliation.
Some years ago, I was at a scholarly conference about the Bar Kokhba revolt, and an Israeli archaeologist mentioned they had actually already located over 500 of these villages. I imagine that by now, he probably found a lot more. So here we see that these events really occurred, and that this war and this tragedy was as great as we find in our sources.
In the ensuing 2 millennia of Jewish exile, the Jews, unlike the Romans, survived and thrived, returned and rebuilt, and continue to eagerly await the fulfillment of God's promise of redemption.
Okay, I'm not sure how many of you were already familiar with the story of Bar Kokhba, but it's some pretty fascinating stuff. And we actually commemorate it in Jewish practice. You might not know it for some reason, not for some reason. The holiday of Tisha B'Av, right, when we fast and we mourn the destruction of the temple, actually also commemorates the fall of Beitar. I don't know the exact numbers, and I always wonder whether this was the greatest Jewish tragedy in terms of loss of life before the Holocaust, because definitely over 1 million people died. The Talmud has a discussion of the fact that he had at least 500,000 soldiers with him. In other words, besides for the 500,000 which were mentioned. So we're talking about over 1 million people for sure, if not many more Jews that died. So it was catastrophic by all senses, and we commemorate it for that reason. That's one of the reasons why we fast on Tisha B'Av. But while it was going on, it wasn't just thousands of Jews following him, which you could just say, oh, he was charismatic, he was a great guy. The Jews this has nothing to do with Mashiach. No, they called him by that name because they thought he was Mashiach, Bar Kokhba, from the verse Darach Kochav Miyakov, that a star will come forth from Jacob. Rabbi Akiva became his arms bearer, as you can see in text 19, which we won't read for lack of time. But Maimonides is pointing out that Rabbi Akiva was his arms bearer because of that. And by the way, the story with which Rabbi Akiva came to believe in him is that actually they say that the Romans had some kind of missile or something, some kind of I don't know, battering something that they used to shoot out of some sort of mechanism, that they would shoot it at the Jewish armies. And Bar Kokhba, being the military general, they say that Rabbi Akiva watched him use his knee to catch them and throw them back and kill many of the Roman forces. This was a miraculous occurrence by all accounts, and that's one of the reasons that Rabbi Akiva came to believe in him. Now, Rabbi Akiva was so the fact there were many Jews following him doesn't necessarily show anything, but the fact that Rabbi Akiva believes in him as Mashiach, that's the key factor. Rabbi Akiva was no small man, you know what I mean? One of the greatest Jewish scholarly people of all time. So if he's doing so because he believes according to Jewish law, this man can actually be Mashiach. All right. Now, then he passes over. Then Bar Kokhba dies, and there's a great calamity, and it's terrible. It's a terrible stain in Jewish history. And obviously, that wasn't supposed to be the moment for Mashiach. But that doesn't mean that Bar Kokhba is looked at as a villain in Jewish history. He's not. He's not. He's a hero. Besides the fact that he led a rebellion, which makes him a military hero, but he's a man who fought the Romans and wanted Jewish independence and wanted Jewish the keeping of Torah and mitzvahs, etc. And so he would be a king from the house of David, of King David, who died. An amazing king who led whatever he led, in this case, a Mashiach bid, and he passed away. Shabtai Tzvi, on the other hand, was the exact opposite. I won't spend that much time talking about Shabtai Tzvi, but he was born in 1626, and at the age of 22, he decided that he's the Mashiach. He was very charismatic. He learned a lot of Torah. He lived in a place that was known as Izmir, which today would be Turkey, and he mastered not just kind of the Talmud and the Torah, but also Kabbalah. And like I said, he was very, very charismatic and also handsome, which is a key component. Now, he also happened to live in the 1600s, which means that there wasn't that much communication, right? So not like in today's day and age where something happens in New York and everybody knows about it in Los Angeles seconds later, right? And Rabbi Hanoka mentioned in his recap of this is funny. He mentioned in his recap of his trip to Israel, he mentioned that when he was at one place, somebody asked him, he's like, how are the Jews in Los Angeles? I heard that in Los Angeles there's anti-Semitism on the streets, right? Because we had a few anti-Semitic. It was just funny that people in Israel are asking him about how the Jews in Los Angeles are doing. So apparently even in today's day and age, there's some disconnect in how the information goes. But there's no question. A part of that is because in a moment, you hear about something happening on the streets of Los Angeles, if it's a big enough thing to happen, such as an anti-Semitic attack, where Palestinians are attacking Jews eating outside a sushi cafe, as I'm sure most of you heard the information, Jews around the world hear about it within seconds. In that day and age, it was not like that, okay? Now, let me explain to you how Shabtai Tzvi started and how he gained the following. First of all, from the moment that he started, he was decrying certain things in the Torah. He was going against certain things in the Torah. I'm not talking about when he was finally vilified as a false Mashiach, which is when he converted to Islam. And he took many Jews with him, unfortunately. I'm talking about way before that. From the beginning, he went against mitzvot from the get-go. Mitzvot from the oral Torah, mitzvot from the written Torah, etc. And this right away led to rabbis putting chayrims, and we have historical evidence of the fact that there were chayrims, which are kind of ostracizations that were placed on him. This is clearly a false Mashiach from the get-go. How did he gain a following? First of all, it was a very, very rough and low time for the Jewish people. This was after the Khmelnytsky pogroms. I think hundreds of thousands of Jews died. Over 500,000 Jews died. And the Jews were at a very low place. It's very, very sad. But he was very charismatic and offered this utopia of we're going to go. And Jews were very, very not very educated at that time. Of course, there were rabbis and there were educated people who knew the halacha and the Jewish law, etc. And they knew right away that he wasn't Mashiach, and they right away didn't follow him. But what he would do is actually, once he was ostracized in one city, he would go to another city. They didn't hear about it, so he gained the following there. A couple of people here, a couple of people there. Before you know it, he's got himself a good following. And that's the difference between a false Mashiach or a failed Mashiach. Okay, let's leave that aside for now, and let's end off with one last point. Which is, what is Mashiach's role in the cosmic plan? Right, just to kind of recap, we were holding here. That's the difference between Shabtai Tzvi and Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba was a failed Mashiach, and Shabtai Tzvi was a false Mashiach. Okay. But possibly most of all, the Rebbe points out what Mashiach's role is in this world. And Vicky, if I can ask you to read the last text for us, please. Hold on. And then we'll end off with that. That's text 20 on page 223. Go ahead.
The need for Mashiach to serve as a monarch is, as defined by Maimonides, to elevate the true faith, fill the world with justice, destroy the power of the wicked, and wage the campaigns of God. Accordingly, once Mashiach has successfully influenced all humanity to serve God in unison, and the entire world will be exclusively engaged in divine pursuits, Mashiach's role as monarch will no longer be necessary to the same degree. At that stage, his primary role will be to teach the people and direct them on the divine path, influencing them as a Nasi, a leader and a teacher.
So it turns out the Mashiach will start off as a king, right? Waging battles, that kind of thing. But actually, that's not his main role. He starts off as the king and organizer of a revolution and starting all that, but eventually it will transition into inspiring teacher and a religious mentor. And his role as king and organizer of wars will no longer be relevant. And we look forward to that time, maybe speedily in our days.
Lesson 5. Out of the Blues. 1. Isaiah describes two options for the redemption: in its time and hastily. If we are meritorious, the redemption will arrive earlier and
yes, okay,
in a sudden and abrupt manner. If not, the redemption will come in its default time, and it will unfold as a gradual process. 2. Malachi prophesies that Elijah the prophet will return before the arrival of the day of God, before the coming of Mashiach. Chief among his duties will be to announce the imminence of Mashiach's arrival. 3. Mashiach will be a mortal who will possess incredible qualities and will achieve tremendous spiritual heights. On top of that, he will be exceedingly humble. The Kabbalists reveal that Mashiach's soul will embody the essence of the collective soul, the Yechida, of all of creation. 4. Maimonides outlines two stages in identifying Mashiach: A. Presumed Mashiach, and B. Confirmed Mashiach. A descendant of King David who is pious and versed in Torah influences the Jewish nation to follow the Torah's ways and wages God's battles is presumed to be Mashiach. If he gathers the Jews to the land of Israel and builds the third holy temple, he is the confirmed Mashiach. 5. Each generation has a potential Mashiach. Throughout history, students of various influential Jewish spiritual leaders have pointed to their leader as the potential Mashiach. However, the redemption has not begun until Mashiach successfully completes the tasks of the confirmed Mashiach. 6. There have been various historical attempts at actual messianic campaigns. Two particularly famous attempts are Bar Kokhba and Shabbatai Tzvi, with the distinction that Bar Kokhba was a failed potential Mashiach, whereas Shabbatai Tzvi was a false Mashiach. 7. At a certain point, Mashiach's role will transition or mature from king to primarily that of an inspiring teacher and religious mentor.
Thank you all for joining us for lesson 5 of This Can Happen Out of the Blues. I hope you gained a little bit more insight to how the process is going to be of Mashiach coming and what exactly it is the Mashiach will do, etc. And we're not done yet. Next week, we're going to keep going on that theme in lesson 6, which is titled And Then. All right. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Rabbi.